Hello, BookTube, and welcome to Shorty September 2025, a fun BookTube event where we concentrate on shorter works, on tiny, wee, sleek little books of 100 pages, 200 pages, something like that. The type of book that, if cell phones had not completely shattered our powers of concentration, pretty much any reader could finish in one sitting. And they have a charm of their own. They have a powerful charm of their own. So I've been throwing myself into Shorty September, and I reread a classic last night. I don't know how many times I've read this book. There'll be a few Shorty September books that are like that, where I don't know how many times I've read it. And this is One Writer's Beginnings by Eudora Welty, with tiny, tiny little original artwork on the cover there, her parents reading to her, and then even smaller original artwork on the back. That is an illustration of her family, mother in the center, siblings all around her, including her brother Bus, who was a certified super hottie, but you can barely see it. You can barely see it. This book has black and white photos, and that is the original, and there is the brother. But even here, you can barely make it out. It'd be nice if that original artwork had had a little bit of room to breathe. But this is autobiographical reminiscences from one of the greatest writers of the 20th century. In the early 1980s, she was asked to give 3 lectures, a series of lectures at Harvard University. She did, and she was pondering them for a long time. She pondered them a long time afterwards, decided to make a book out of them. And they are listening, learning to see, and finding a voice. And you might think from those titles, especially the third one, that these are going to be a lot about, the famous writer ruminates on the shoestring she started with and whatnot. But instead, these are incredibly warm, wonderful, autobiographical sketches of her childhood and youth. And the people in them, especially her parents, but also everybody else, all the people in the small town where she grew up. And it's one in that sense. It's not a formal autobiography. It's a series of transcribed and enlarged lectures. But in that sense, it's one of the best works on that theme that was written in the 20th century, and that it had a lot of competition. There were a lot of such memoirs. But in terms of sheer, quiet, touching humanity, I know of almost no memoirs from writers that exceed this one or equal it. The only other one that really comes to mind is too long for Shorty September. It's Growing Up by Russell Baker. And in that case, I am a little bit biased. But again, I have a couple of biases when it comes to this book as well. This is wonderful. It is largely and very self-consciously the author reflecting on a tenor of American life that she knows perfectly well is vanishing even while she writes about it. In the 1980s, the South that she's writing about here is largely going. The South where an automobile is new, where not everybody would have one, where if you had a car, you were expected, as a matter of courtesy, to drive different people on the Sunday that you drive into town. You were expected to cast around and find out who else had to go, not make a solitary trip. And many, many other little details like that. Although, in the first 2 parts of this book, which is not long, I cannot recommend you strongly enough to read it. In the first 2 parts, the main characters are family, especially her mother, who is here portrayed with such an amazing combination of clear-eyed objectivity and absolute loving devotion that it amazes me that even a writer of Eudora Welty's skill could walk that line so consistently for so long. It is marvelous the way it's done. You read the book without Eudora Welty, if you could imagine doing that. You might think that her mother was a little overprotective, a little overzealous towards her children, maybe a little doubtful of their ability to make it on their own. Famously, she expressed wholehearted approval that young Eudora wanted to be a writer because she viewed writing as safe. Eudora Welty used to love to comment that. Used to love to repeat that comment, and the strong implication, the twinkle in her eye, the twinkle in her voice, was that, of course, writing is not safe. Writing is not safe. As she ought to have known for when she was writing, but her mother thought, wasn't that nice? You'll write pretty little stories for Ladies' Home Journal, and that'll be nice and safe. But that combination that ability on your part as a reader to see her mother as overbearing and overprotective, to have her actually described that way, and yet lovingly, is incredible. Where she's constantly over supervising young Eudora and constantly under recognizing how vast Eudora Welty's imagination is, how vast her creative powers are, largely because they weren't shared by her brothers, I think. Like, for instance, Eudora Welty in one early part of the book mentions that there were no store-bought goods here. You wanted new clothing, you had it made, you made it yourself. And there was a woman, a large black woman in town named Fanny, who would go around to the houses and do that. She was incredibly skilled at doing that. And while she was doing it, so while she had the little child up on a stool and was on her knees with a mouthful of pins, working out the sizes and the shape of the garment that she was going to sew, she would be talking nonstop, a nonstop flow of gossip. And Eudora Welty writes that her mother used to get protective of that and say, well, that's enough of that. I don't want her hearing that. Like she was afraid that gossip was communicable like measles, and didn't want her children exposed to it. And Eudora Welty just frankly says that I wasn't exposed to it enough. I couldn't get enough of it. And it's rather that scene is rather amazing because Fanny has a mouthful of pins, her hearers can't always or often make sense of the stories that she's saying. It's not so much that as it is the burble of the stories themselves that affects Eudora Welty when she's young. When she's a small child, for instance, and they are going on a car ride into town, she records the anecdote of her mother that once everyone was settled in the car, little Eudora would be on the knees of the two ladies in the back, and she would just peremptorily say, "Now talk." She'd be telling the older women to talk, not because she was understanding any of the stories involved, but just the stories themselves. But we'll get to that. This element about her mother is perfectly summed up in one paragraph, where she says, "Even as we grew up, my mother could not help imposing herself between her children and whatever it is they might take in mind to reach out for in the world. For she would give it to them if it were good enough for them, she would have to be very sure, and give it to them at whatever cost to herself. Valiance was in her every fiber. She stood always prepared in herself to challenge the world in our place. She did indeed tend to make the world look dangerous, and so it had been to her. A way had to be found around her love sometimes, without challenging that, and at the same time cherishing it as an unassailable strength. Each of us children did, sooner or later, in part at least, solve this in a different, respectful, complicated way." They had to get around her love in order to go out and see the world. And in the slow process of the events in this book, we see Eudora Welty slowly going out to encounter the world. That is a presage of what does happen in this book. Not, again, a formal autobiography, but you very much watch that process happen as she becomes a writer. And later on, as the book progresses, starts to refer more and more to writing, and especially to her own writing. But she remembers all those visits. She remembers visiting her grandparents and the big to-do that was made out of the visit, and then the visit itself, which you wouldn't think would be a congenial memory for a lively little girl, because neither her grandfather nor her grandmother were much for talking. Her grandfather, she tells us, only perked up and started talking when he was delivering them to the train station on the way back home. He wasn't really interested in them up until then. And also she says the same thing about her mother. That her mother thought that writing was safe because stories never seemed real to her. That in her family it was absolutely forbidden, it was unthought of that anyone would lie, but that seeping out from that is that also no one would imagine. And we learn that those memories are part of the genesis of a writer, of one writer's beginnings. In this passage here, I think now, looking back on these summer trips, this one and a number later, made in the car or on the train, that another element in them must have been influencing my mind. The trips were wholes unto themselves. They were stories. Not only in form, but in their taking on direction, movement, development, change. They changed something in my life. Each trip made its particular revelation, though I could not have found words for it. But with the passage of time, I could look back on them and see them bringing me news, discoveries, premonitions, promises. I still can. They still do. When I did begin to write, the short story was a shape that had already formed itself and stood waiting in the back of my mind. Nor is it surprising to me that when I made my first attempt at a novel, I entered into its world as a child riding there on a train. And that is just wonderful. Not only the fact that all of these memories are also stories, but that they still are. That they still reveal things. They still make premonitions. They still make promises. Because, not to get too treacly here, but any of you who've ever read Eudora Welty's short stories will know she manages the amazing feat of transposing that very quality to her own work. You don't ever read a Eudora Welty short story once. You don't ever want to. They continue to teach decades and decades after she died. That is amazing that in this book we so clearly learn the wellspring of that genius and see it for the marvel that it is. How many people have stories like that in their past? They don't manage to convey not only the stories themselves, but that eternal nowness of her fiction. I love this book. I read it again last night and was just starry-eyed all over again, just caught up completely all over again. I cannot recommend it strongly enough, although it isn't my primary recommendation, and I don't think I risk the wrath of the author if I say this. You should read Eudora Welty's short stories. If you haven't, you should. Read her short stories. Then you can get around to this. But for Shorty September, how overjoyed, how wonderful that Shorty September brought me back to this mass market paperback when I might otherwise never have gone. So there you go. Another strong recommendation for Shorty September. I will wrap this up for now. I'll see you next time. Thank you, BookTube.